between our people. This relationship, which, with good reason, we and our predecessors have long called special, has made us safer and stronger through the generations.
King Charles just destroyed Camilla in front of the entire world. The cameras were rolling when he delivered the most shocking announcement in royal history, stripping his own wife of her crown. You won't believe what Diana's missing jewelry revealed about Camilla's secret deals. Palace insiders are calling it the biggest royal scandal since the abdication crisis.
And like each one of you here, she loved to write. For a decade, she wrote poems, stories, and reviews of plays, until from her pen sprang one of the best-loved characters in literature, and certainly everybody's favorite nanny.
The crisp October morning of 2025 began like any other at Clarence House, but by noon, the British monarchy would face one of its most unprecedented crises in modern history. At approximately 11:47 a.m., King Charles III stepped before a hastily assembled press conference, his face bearing the weight of a decision that would send shockwaves through the Commonwealth and beyond. The announcement was brief but devastating. In a voice that trembled with barely contained emotion, the king declared that Queen Consort Camilla would immediately relinquish her royal title pending a formal investigation. The words hung in the air of the ornate room, where centuries of royal tradition suddenly felt fragile and uncertain. Behind the king, the Queen Mary's crown sat on its ceremonial pedestal, its famous Cullinan diamonds catching the camera lights like fragments of a shattered dream. This was not a decision born from political pressure or public scandal in the traditional sense. Instead, it emerged from something far more personal and painful. The catalyst was a seemingly small item that carried enormous symbolic weight, a sapphire brooch that had once belonged to Princess Diana. The piece, which featured a distinctive oval sapphire surrounded by diamonds, had been part of Diana's personal jewelry collection during her early years as Princess of Wales. The brooch's journey from royal vault to public auction house began innocuously enough. In late September 2025, the piece appeared in a catalog for a prestigious Geneva auction house, listed under the generic description of Royal Heritage Jewelry 20th Century. The auction house, known for handling high-value estate pieces, had acquired the brooch through what they described as legitimate private channels. However, eagle-eyed royal jewelry experts and Diana enthusiasts quickly recognized the piece from archived photographs of the late princess. Social media began buzzing with comparisons between the auction listing and historical images of Diana wearing the brooch at various royal engagements in the early 1980s. Within days, major news outlets picked up the story, and questions began mounting about how such a significant piece of royal history had found its way to a Swiss auction house. The situation became more serious when investigators from the Royal Collection Trust, the organization responsible for safeguarding the monarchy's artistic and cultural treasures, confirmed that the brooch matched detailed records in their archives. According to their documentation, the piece should have been secured within the royal collection following Diana's death in 1997, along with other items designated for eventual inheritance by her sons. What made the discovery particularly troubling was the paper trail that emerged during the initial investigation. Documents obtained by palace officials showed that the brooch had been consigned to the auction house through a series of intermediaries, but the ultimate source appeared to trace back to Raymill House, Camilla's private residence in Wiltshire. The connection was not immediately obvious, involving several shell companies and private dealers, but forensic accounting eventually revealed the link. The revelation sent tremors through the highest levels of the royal household. For King Charles, the implications were devastating on multiple levels. Not only did it suggest a breach of trust within his own family, but it also threatened to reignite painful memories and controversies surrounding his relationship with both Diana and Camilla that the monarchy had spent decades trying to resolve. Princess Anne was reportedly the first senior royal to demand answers. Known for her direct approach and unwavering sense of duty, she immediately called for a comprehensive audit of royal jewelry holdings. Her concerns went beyond this single piece. If one item could disappear unnoticed, what else might be missing from the collection? Prince William's reaction was described by palace insiders as one of quiet fury mixed with deep sadness. The brooch represented more than just a piece of jewelry. It was a tangible connection to his mother's memory. Sources close to the Prince of Wales indicated that he felt a personal responsibility to ensure his mother's legacy remained untainted by scandal or controversy. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, found herself in a particularly delicate position. As someone who had worked hard to honor Diana's memory while carving out her own role within the royal family, she was reportedly instrumental in urging the family to address the situation transparently, regardless of the personal cost. The initial palace response followed traditional protocols. Officials issued carefully worded statements about conducting an internal review and cooperating with relevant authorities. Behind the scenes, however, the situation was far more urgent. The King's private secretary was tasked with coordinating between multiple agencies, including the Metropolitan Police's Art and Antiques Unit, which specializes in investigating stolen cultural artifacts. The Geneva auction house initially maintained that they had followed all proper procedures for verifying the provenance of consigned items. However, as pressure mounted from both British authorities and international media, they agreed to suspend the sale and cooperate fully with the investigation. The brooch was placed in secure storage while experts worked to trace its complete ownership history. Meanwhile, the story was beginning to capture global attention. Royal watchers, who had long speculated about tensions within the family, saw this as confirmation of deeper issues. Social media platforms buzzed with theories and speculation, while traditional media outlets scrambled to verify details and provide context about the significance of Diana's jewelry within the broader royal collection. The timing could hardly have been worse for the monarchy. The royal family had been working to modernize their image and increase transparency in their operations. King Charles had made public commitments to making the institution more accountable and accessible to the British people. Now, they faced accusations of the very kind of secrecy and privilege that critics had long challenged. International observers noted the irony that a piece of jewelry, which had once symbolized the glamour and tragedy of Diana's story, was now threatening to create new upheaval for the institution she had struggled with during her lifetime. The brooch, in its way, had become a symbol of unfinished business and unresolved tensions that continued to shadow the modern monarchy. As October progressed and the investigation deepened, it became clear that this was not simply a case of missing paperwork or administrative oversight. The evidence suggested deliberate actions had been taken to remove the brooch from royal custody and convert it into private gain. For a family that had built its reputation on duty, service, and stewardship of national treasures, the implications were profound and potentially irreversible. The investigation that would ultimately bring down Queen Consort Camilla began not with dramatic raids or public accusations, but with the meticulous work of archivists and accountants poring over decades of jewelry records. As autumn deepened in 2025, what had started as a routine verification process transformed into something far more serious and damaging. The Royal Collection Trust, which maintains detailed records of every significant piece in the monarchy's possession, launched what they termed a comprehensive provenance review in early October. This was a palace speech for a full-scale audit designed to determine whether other items might be missing from the collection. The review was led by Dr. Margaret Thornfield, a respected art historian who had previously worked on restitution cases involving Nazi-looted artwork during World War II. Dr. Thornfield's team began by cross-referencing physical inventory against historical records dating back to Queen Elizabeth II's reign. What they discovered was troubling. The sapphire brooch was not an isolated case. Several other pieces with connections to Princess Diana showed discrepancies in their documentation. Some items listed as being in secure storage could not be located, while others had valuation notes and handling records that raised questions about unauthorized access. The most damaging discovery came when investigators found a series of handwritten notations in the jewelry registry bearing what appeared to be Camilla's initials. These notes, dating from various periods between 2020 and 2024, indicated changes in storage locations and valuations for specific pieces. While such notations were not necessarily improper, they suggested a level of personal involvement in managing the collection that went beyond what would typically be expected from a consort. Princess Anne, who had long served as one of the monarchy's most trusted guardians of protocol and tradition, became increasingly concerned as the audit progressed. Known for her no-nonsense approach to royal duties, she began making unscheduled visits to storage facilities and asking pointed questions about security procedures. Her involvement signaled to palace staff that this was being treated as a serious institutional matter, not merely a family dispute. The situation became more complex when investigators attempted to trace the exact chain of custody for the missing brooch. The Geneva auction house provided detailed records showing that the piece had been consigned through a London-based dealer specializing in estate jewelry. This dealer, in turn, had acquired it from a private collector who claimed to have purchased it legitimately from an unnamed source several years earlier. However, when authorities attempted to verify these claims, they encountered what appeared to be a deliberately obscured paper trail. The private collector operated through a series of offshore companies registered in jurisdictions known for their financial privacy protections. Bank records, where they could be obtained, showed transfers of funds that corresponded to the timing of various jewelry transactions. But the ultimate beneficiaries remained hidden behind layers of corporate structures. The breakthrough came when digital forensics experts examining communications records discovered encrypted email exchanges between parties involved in the jewelry trade. While the encryption initially prevented investigators from reading the contents, metadata analysis revealed timing patterns that correlated with known dates when pieces had been removed from royal storage for cleaning, exhibition, or other legitimate purposes. Prince William's involvement in the investigation intensified during this period. Unlike his father, who appeared torn between institutional duty and personal loyalty, William approached the situation with what aides described as cold determination. He had grown up watching his mother navigate the complexities of royal life, and he understood better than most how damaging it could be when private actions became public scandals. Working closely with Catherine, William began documenting what they called the integrity framework, a set of principles and procedures they believed should govern the royal family's relationship with their inherited treasures. This document, which would later influence the family's response to the crisis, emphasized transparency, accountability, and the public trust nature of royal possessions. Catherine's role during this period was particularly delicate. As someone who had married into the family and worked hard to establish her own relationship with Diana's legacy, she found herself in the position of defending that legacy against potential exploitation. Friends described her as being deeply troubled by the suggestion that Diana's memory was being commercialized, particularly given the care she had taken to honor the late princess through her own charitable work and public appearances. The investigation took a more serious turn when the Metropolitan Police's Art and Antiques Unit became formally involved. This specialized division, which typically handles cases involving stolen paintings and archaeological artifacts, brought forensic capabilities that went beyond what the palace's internal resources could provide. Their involvement also meant that the matter was now being treated as a potential criminal investigation, not merely an internal royal dispute. Detective Chief Inspector Sarah Reynolds, who led the police investigation, had previously worked on high-profile cases involving art theft and money laundering. Her team's analysis of financial records revealed a pattern of transactions that suggested systematic rather than opportunistic behavior. Multiple pieces appeared to have been moved through similar networks of dealers and collectors, implying an organized operation rather than isolated incidents. The emotional toll on King Charles during this period was evident to those who worked closely with him. Palace staff reported that he appeared increasingly withdrawn and spent long hours in private meetings with legal advisors and senior courtiers. The king, who had waited decades to assume the throne, now faced the possibility that his reign would be defined by scandal involving the woman he loved. The strain on the royal household was also becoming apparent in more subtle ways. Traditional ceremonial events were scaled back or postponed without explanation. The annual Heritage Gala, which had been planned as a celebration of British craftsmanship and royal patronage, was quietly cancelled. Staff noticed increased security around jewelry storage areas and more restrictive access procedures for handling valuable items. Media pressure intensified as journalists began investigating the broader implications of the scandal. Royal correspondents, who had covered the family for decades, noted that this situation was different from previous controversies because it involved questions of criminal behavior rather than personal indiscretions or political missteps. The technical nature of the allegations also made the story more difficult for the palace to dismiss or deflect through traditional public relations strategies. International reaction began to emerge as the story gained traction in foreign media outlets. The French press, which had closely followed Diana's story during her lifetime, treated the jewelry scandal as vindication of their long-held skepticism about the royal family's treatment of the late princess. American media outlets framed the story within broader narratives about wealth inequality and institutional privilege, while Commonwealth nations watched carefully to see how the scandal might affect their relationships with the crown. By late October, it had become clear that the investigation was approaching a critical juncture. The evidence was mounting, but the palace faced a fundamental choice about how to proceed. They could continue to handle the matter privately, hoping to contain the damage and reach some form of internal resolution. Alternatively, they could acknowledge the seriousness of the situation publicly and take decisive action to demonstrate their commitment to accountability and transparency. The decision, when it came, would not be driven by legal requirements or media pressure, but by something more fundamental: the monarchy's understanding of its own moral authority and its relationship with the British people, who ultimately legitimized its existence. The confrontation that would define King Charles's reign began not in the grand ceremonial rooms of Buckingham Palace, but in the more intimate setting of Clarence House's Maple Room. It was here, on the evening of October 11th, that the royal family would face what palace insiders later described as their most difficult internal crisis since the abdication of Edward VIII in 1936. The meeting had been arranged with the formal protocols typically reserved for matters of state. Princess Anne arrived first, her car pulling through the gates of Clarence House at precisely 7 o'clock. Her presence immediately signaled to staff that this was not a routine family gathering. Anne had built her reputation on directness and institutional loyalty, qualities that made her both respected and sometimes feared within royal circles. Prince William and Catherine arrived shortly after, their official car followed by a second vehicle carrying private secretaries and legal advisors. The formality of their arrival contrasted sharply with their usual family visits, where they might bring their children or arrive in personal vehicles. Tonight, they came as representatives of the institution's future, not as family members seeking reconciliation. King Charles had spent the afternoon in preparation for what he knew would be the most difficult conversation of his reign. Aides reported that he had reviewed the investigation files multiple times, consulted with constitutional experts, and spoken privately with his most trusted advisors. The weight of the decision he faced was evident in his demeanor. Palace staff noted that he appeared to have aged years in the weeks since the scandal first emerged. The room itself carried symbolic weight. The Maple Room had been the site of numerous historic royal decisions, including meetings during the constitutional crisis of 1936 and planning sessions for Elizabeth II's coronation. The mahogany table at its center had witnessed generations of royal deliberations, but none quite like what was about to unfold. Camilla arrived last, accompanied only by her private secretary. The protocol surrounding her entrance had been carefully considered, too formal, and it would suggest she was being treated as a defendant, too casual, and it might imply the family was not taking the matter seriously. In the end, she was received with the courtesy due to her position, but the atmosphere remained unmistakably tense. The meeting began with a presentation of the investigation's findings by the lead investigator from the Royal Collection Trust. The evidence was laid out methodically: the auction house documentation, the financial trail connecting the brooch to Raymil House, the pattern of other missing items, and the handwritten notations bearing Camilla's initials. Each piece of evidence was presented without editorial comment, but the cumulative effect was devastating. Camilla's initial response was one of bewilderment rather than denial. She acknowledged that her signature appeared on various documents related to jewelry handling, but insisted that she had been acting under guidance from palace staff and had no knowledge of any improper sales. Her explanation was that she had been asked to assist with reorganizing and cataloging portions of the collection, a task she had undertaken believing it to be part of her official duties. Princess Anne's questioning was direct and methodical. As someone who had spent decades managing her own charitable organizations and understanding the importance of proper oversight, she pressed for specific details about who had provided instructions and when various transactions had taken place. Her approach was professional rather than accusatory, but the implications of her questions were clear. William's involvement in the discussion marked a generational shift in how the royal family approached crisis management. Unlike previous scandals that had been handled primarily by senior courtiers and advisors, William took an active role in questioning and decision-making. His questions focused on the broader implications for the monarchy's reputation and the precedent that would be set by how they handled the situation. Catherine's contributions were fewer but significant. As someone who had worked carefully to establish her own relationship with Diana's legacy, she spoke about the symbolic importance of the jewelry and what its disappearance meant for public trust in the institution. Her perspective carried particular weight because she had no personal history with the conflicts that had defined earlier relationships within the family. The discussion continued for several hours, with periodic breaks for private consultations between family members and their advisors. The complexity of the situation became apparent as they wrestled with questions that went beyond the immediate facts of the case. How could they balance family loyalty with institutional responsibility? What precedent would their decisions set for future crises? How could they maintain public confidence while dealing with what appeared to be criminal behavior within their own family? The turning point came when Charles himself acknowledged that the evidence, regardless of intent or explanation, had created an untenable situation. The monarchy's authority depended on its moral standing with the British people, and that standing could not survive the appearance of profiting from items that belonged to the nation's heritage. The technical question of whether laws had been broken was less important than the fundamental question of whether public trust could be maintained. The family's legal advisors presented several options for moving forward. They could handle the matter privately, perhaps through restitution and internal disciplinary measures. They could cooperate with law enforcement while maintaining that the issues were being addressed internally. Or they could take the unprecedented step of public acknowledgement and formal separation from the individual involved. The discussion of consequences was particularly difficult. Removing Camilla's title would be an extraordinary measure with no modern precedent. It would inevitably invite comparisons to historical crises and raise questions about the stability of the monarchy itself. However, failing to take decisive action might create an even greater long-term threat to the institution's credibility. William's position was that the monarchy had to demonstrate its commitment to the same standards it expected from other institutions in British society. Catherine supported this view, arguing that transparency and accountability were essential for maintaining public support, particularly among younger generations, who were already skeptical of inherited privilege. The decision, when it finally came, was reached through what participants later described as consensus rather than formal voting. Charles acknowledged that he could not continue to defend the indefensible, and that his role as monarch required him to place institutional integrity above personal relationships. The choice was painful, but clear. Camilla would relinquish her title and withdraw from royal duties pending the completion of the investigation. The practical arrangements for implementing this decision required careful coordination between multiple parties. Legal documents had to be prepared, security arrangements reviewed, and communication strategies developed. The palace's media team worked through the night to prepare statements and anticipate questions from the press. Perhaps most significantly, the family had to grapple with the personal dynamics of their decision. This was not simply an administrative or legal matter, but a fundamental change in the relationships that had defined Charles's personal life for decades. The institutional demands of monarchy had once again required personal sacrifice, echoing the conflicts that had shaped the royal family throughout its modern history. As dawn approached on October 12th, the die had been cast. The decision that would reshape the British monarchy had been made not by external pressure or legal requirements, but by the family's own recognition that their survival depended on their willingness to hold themselves accountable to the standards they proclaimed to represent. The morning of October 13, 2025, dawned gray and cold across London, with low clouds hanging over the capital like a shroud. By 9 a.m., journalists from around the world had gathered outside Clarence House, their breath visible in the crisp autumn air, as they prepared for what palace sources had confirmed would be a significant announcement from King Charles III. The atmosphere was tense with anticipation, but few could have predicted the magnitude of what they were about to witness. Inside Clarence House, the final preparations were being made for an announcement that would redefine the British monarchy. King Charles had spent the early morning hours in private consultation with his closest advisors, reviewing the statement that had been carefully crafted over the previous 48 hours. Every word had been scrutinized for its legal implications, historical precedent, and potential impact on public opinion both domestically and internationally. The Grand Hall had been prepared with unusual attention to detail. The podium was positioned to ensure optimal camera angles, while the lighting was adjusted to provide the gravitas appropriate for such a momentous occasion. Behind the speaking position, the Queen Mary's crown had been placed on a velvet-draped stand, its Cullinan diamonds catching the artificial lights like captured stars. The symbolism was deliberate. The crown would serve as a silent witness to the words that would strip away the title of the woman who had worn it just months earlier. At precisely 10 a.m., King Charles entered the hall. His appearance immediately conveyed the weight of the moment. His military uniform was impeccable, adorned with the ribbons and medals that represented decades of service. But his face bore the unmistakable marks of someone who had aged considerably in recent weeks. Palace staff later commented that they had never seen the king look so burdened by the responsibilities of his position. The assembled audience included senior members of the royal household, representatives from the government, select members of the press, and a handful of constitutional experts whose presence underscored the historic nature of the proceedings. Prince William stood behind his father, his posture rigid with the formal bearing expected of the heir apparent. Catherine was beside him, her expression carefully composed, but her eyes reflecting the gravity of the situation they all faced. Princess Anne occupied a position slightly apart from the others, her presence serving as a reminder of the institutional continuity that transcended individual relationships. Her role in the events leading to this moment had been crucial, and her visible support for the king's decision would be noted by constitutional observers as significant for the monarchy's future stability. When King Charles began to speak, his voice was measured but carried an undertone of profound sadness. The statement he delivered had been crafted to balance multiple competing demands: the need for transparency, the requirements of any ongoing legal proceedings, the preservation of institutional dignity, and acknowledgement of the personal pain involved in the decision. The core announcement was delivered in language that was both formal and unmistakably final. Queen Consort Camilla would immediately relinquish her royal title and withdraw from all official duties pending the completion of investigations into matters involving royal heritage items. The king emphasized that this decision had been made to preserve the integrity of the crown as an institution and to maintain the trust between the monarchy and the British people. The reaction in the hall was immediate but subdued. The gravity of the moment seemed to suppress any dramatic responses, but the significance was unmistakable. Cameras captured every nuance of the king's delivery, from the slight tremor in his hands as he gripped the podium, to the moment when his voice briefly faltered as he spoke about the necessity of placing institutional duty above personal loyalty. The king's statement also addressed the broader implications of the scandal. He spoke about the monarchy's responsibility as custodian of the nation's heritage and the importance of maintaining the highest standards of accountability in that role. His words were carefully chosen to acknowledge wrongdoing without prejudicing any legal proceedings. But the message was clear. The royal family would not be above the same standards expected of other institutions in British society. Outside Clarence House, the crowd's reaction was immediate and complex. Some observers cheered, interpreting the announcement as justice for Princess Diana, and vindication of those who had long questioned Camilla's role within the royal family. Others remained silent, perhaps processing the implications of what they had just witnessed. A small group of monarchist supporters appeared visibly distressed, recognizing that this crisis represented a fundamental challenge to the institution they revered. The media response was swift and global. Within minutes of the king's statement, major news networks around the world interrupted their regular programming to report the news. The BBC led with the headline, "King Charles strips Camilla of royal title," while international outlets focused on the unprecedented nature of the decision and its potential implications for the monarchy's future. Social media platforms exploded with reactions ranging from support for the king's decision to speculation about what this meant for the line of succession. Hashtags related to Princess Diana began trending worldwide as people drew connections between the current crisis and the unresolved tensions from decades past. The symbolic power of the jewelry at the center of the scandal resonated particularly strongly with those who had followed Diana's story. The immediate aftermath of the announcement saw a carefully choreographed transition of responsibilities. William and Catherine's first public appearance following the announcement came later that same day at a children's charity event that had been scheduled weeks earlier. Their decision to maintain their planned engagement was seen as a signal that the working royals would continue their duties despite the family crisis. The visual message of their appearance was carefully managed. Catherine wore a simple navy dress with minimal jewelry, projecting an image of understated dignity that contrasted sharply with the opulence that had become associated with royal scandal. William's brief remarks to the press emphasized continuity and service, themes that would become central to the family's public messaging in the weeks that followed. Meanwhile, at Camilla House, Camilla began what palace sources described as a period of reflection and private consultation. The practical implications of her changed status were immediate and comprehensive. Her personal protection detail was reduced, her official schedule was cleared indefinitely, and the various patronages and charitable roles she had assumed were quietly redistributed among other members of the royal family. The legal implications of the situation continued to unfold in the days following the announcement. The Metropolitan Police confirmed that their investigation would continue, but emphasized that the removal of Camilla's title did not prejudice any potential criminal proceedings. Legal experts noted that the separation of the personal and institutional aspects of the case created a complex precedent that would likely influence how similar situations might be handled in the future. International reaction to the crisis revealed the global significance of the British monarchy in the 21st century. Commonwealth nations watched carefully to see how the scandal might affect their own relationships with the crown, while European royal families privately discussed the implications for their own institutions. The crisis demonstrated how quickly modern communications could transform a domestic scandal into an international diplomatic consideration. The transfer of symbolic authority became apparent in subtle ways over the following weeks. Catherine was photographed wearing pieces from the royal jewelry collection that had previously been associated with Camilla, including Queen Elizabeth II's pearl necklace and several brooches with historical significance. These appearances were not explicitly announced, but royal watchers understood their meaning. The visual symbols of royal authority were being redistributed to reflect the new reality. The broader constitutional implications of the crisis began to emerge as legal scholars and political commentators analyzed the precedent that had been set. The king's decision to remove his wife's title represented an assertion of institutional authority that went beyond personal relationships. But it also raised questions about the balance of power within the modern monarchy and the extent to which traditional protocols could address contemporary challenges. Public opinion polling in the weeks following the announcement showed a complex picture of British attitudes toward the crisis. While a majority supported the king's decision to prioritize institutional integrity, there was also significant sympathy for the personal cost he had paid. Younger respondents were more likely to view the crisis as evidence that the monarchy needed fundamental reform, while older citizens tended to see it as proof that the institution could adapt and maintain its moral authority. The economic implications extended beyond the immediate costs of the investigation and reorganization. Tourism officials noted fluctuations in visitor numbers to royal sites, while the broader brand value of the British monarchy, estimated to contribute billions to the national economy, faced potential long-term impacts depending on how successfully the institution managed its recovery from the crisis. As autumn turned to winter, the royal family began the slow process of rebuilding public confidence. Their approach emphasized transparency, accountability, and a renewed commitment to the values they claimed to represent. New protocols were established for managing royal collections, additional oversight mechanisms were implemented, and a comprehensive review of financial procedures was announced. The personal cost to King Charles became increasingly apparent to those who observed him closely. Friends and advisors noted that he had aged visibly during the crisis, and his public appearances carried a weight of sadness that had not been present earlier in his reign. The man who had waited decades to become king now faced the reality that his reign would be forever marked by this painful decision to choose institutional duty over personal loyalty. The story of the sapphire brooch had evolved from a simple case of missing jewelry into a fundamental test of the monarchy's ability to maintain its relevance and moral authority in the modern world. The decision to remove Camilla's title represented more than just a response to scandal. It was a statement about what the institution valued most and how far it was willing to go to preserve those values. As 2025 drew to a close, the British monarchy stood transformed by crisis, but perhaps stronger for having faced it directly. The painful lessons of those autumn weeks would influence royal protocols for generations to come, serving as a reminder that even the oldest institutions must sometimes sacrifice individual relationships to preserve their broader purpose and public trust.